Okay. So we're talking about parasympathetic nervous system, right? So we just went over the 4 cranial nerves, right? What were they again? Vagus, facial, glossopharyngeal, and oculomotor. Rosario? No? Yes. Okay. If I say your name, just nod at me for the first few weeks. I'll eventually get it. I'm trying to learn your names. That's why. Okay. Okay, so there are pelvic splanchnic nerves that are also involved in this response. So these are cells with preganglionic axons that start in the lateral gray region of the spinal cord, S2 to S4. So this is where the cell bodies are going to originate. They're going to send out axons to the ganglionic neurons in either terminal or intramural ganglia. So these are pelvic splanchnic nerves. So what is this going to innervate? They're pelvic nerves, pelvic splanchnic nerves, bladder and reproductive organs and colon, bowels. Yes, exactly. So we're looking at bladder, bowels, reproductive organs here. This also contributes to the superior and inferior hypogastric plexuses. And the postganglionic neurons can go to abdominal or pelvic effector tissues. So the main goal of these pelvic splanchnic nerves is to assist in smooth muscle contraction, increased secretions in all of that area. So smooth muscle contraction is going to do what as far as blood vessels? Well, if they're contracting, they'll constrict the blood vessels. So constriction and dilation of blood vessels. Also secretions for urinary and digestive processes and for erectoral function. So if you're needing any sort of change in blood flow to the clitoris or to the penis for erectile functions, it's going to be because of these pelvic splanchnic nerves, changing the contraction of the blood vessels. Specifically, the smooth muscle around the blood vessels is going to either contract or relax to change the blood flow, either constrict blood vessels or dilate blood vessels, increasing blood flow to the genitals. That's all parasympathetic. So we start at the top. Parasympathetic innervates the lacrimal gland, the pterygopalatine ganglia, salivary glands, the heart, respiratory, through cranial nerve 10, all of this down here. This is everything down from the heart all the way to the rectum. So all of the abdominal organs, the reproductive organs, the testes, the ovaries, the uterus. All of that is parasympathetic. What does that mean about childbirth? The uterus is innervated with parasympathetic responses. If y'all remember from 2401, childbirth was what kind of feedback? Positive feedback. Okay, can we review what positive feedback is? Feeds into itself, exactly. So there's a stimulus, it initiates a response. That response initiates more stimuli, more response, more stimuli, more response. So in childbirth, the uterus only contracts because the baby's head presses against the cervix. The cervix sends signals to the brain. The pituitary gland releases oxytocin in response to those signals, causing the uterus to continue to contract. The more that uterus contracts, the more the baby presses, the more that stimulus is sent to the brain, the more oxytocin is released. If the uterus is innervated by the parasympathetic response, rest and digest, what does that have to do with childbirth? Oh yeah, it's autonomic. Yes. What does that mean about the state of the organism during childbirth? Well, you're not technically resting now, but you need to be in a state of rest in order to go through labor. If you have a sympathetic response, if a sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is activated, childbirth is going to be inhibited. Labor is going to be inhibited. You're not going to be able to activate this parasympathetic feed-forward mechanism for that positive feedback in order to birth that baby. So if there's any sort of parasympathetic or high stress situation, your sympathetic side is going to be activated. Parasympathetic is going to be inhibited. Can't have that baby. Can't get a baby out. They're always in balance with each other. One has to take over for certain processes. The other has to take over in other situations. In this specific positive feedback situation, parasympathetic innervation is what's going to primarily be involved in childbirth. You're stressed out, you're not going to have that baby. So here's an example. I had 3 manuscripts and a grant due when I was very, very pregnant. I went into labor about an hour after I submitted the last manuscript. I hit submit, and within an hour, my water broke. Yeah.
So stress puts you into labor, but you can't proceed with labor?
Stress doesn't put you into labor. You can't go into labor unless you're relaxed enough and safe enough, unless your brain feels, your parasympathetic nervous system feels like the stress level is low enough, the danger is low enough, you don't go into labor. It feels stressful when we're there, but you don't go into labor if you're in high stress mode. Yeah. Literally within an hour. Submitted that paper. At least your body was feeling it. Well, yeah, that's true. My body knew what it was doing. I didn't. I should have procrastinated on that paper a little longer.
Stress, like if you have something wrong with you too, like if you're preeclamptic or you're.
Yeah. Is it you feeling it now? You thinking? So you had preeclampsia, right?
Yeah.
So you didn't go into labor on your own, did you?
No.
Your body's too stressed. Sympathetic nervous system.
My blood pressure was like 190 over 160.
Yeah, mine got up about that high too. But that was just because I was mad.
But now it makes sense.
Yeah, now it makes sense. So all of these systems, all of these physiological processes I was really mad. Like the nurse was afraid of me. All of these processes are in balance. One is going to be dominating during certain activities because that's where the nerves are innervating the necessary tissues. Others will dominate during other activities because that, like when you're getting up in the middle of the night and you're checking to see if your kid is breathing, that's sympathetic. That's not parasympathetic. But you have to be in a state of rest, a state of relative calm, low stress, for the parasympathetic activation to take place to initiate childbirth. Okay, here's some review questions. Remember, I'm not going over these in class typically, but I want y'all to use these as you're reviewing on your own. Okay, so we want to talk about the preganglionic neuronal cell bodies next time. We're going to look at the left and right sympathetic trunks and talk about the white and gray rami. Who remembers the rami? That was basically everybody's reaction to that lecture, so we're going to go over it a little bit. Okay, you're going to want to make sure that you can explain the differences between the sympathetic ganglia and the prevertebral ganglia, so watch out for that as we're coming up. Looking at the 4 pathways, and we're going to talk about effector organs that are associated with each pathway. Okay, so this is sympathetic. So the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is fight or flight, exercise and emergency. These nerves are located along the main trunk of your body, thoracolumbar. So thoracic area and lumbar area. These ganglia are anatomically opposite to the parasympathetic. So the parasympathetic ganglia were really close to the tissues that they were acting on. Here the ganglia are close to the spinal cord or the brainstem, depending on where we're at. Actually, no, it's all spinal cord. There's nothing here close to the brainstem. The anatomical pathways get really wild for the sympathetic division. Why? Why is the sympathetic so much more complicated than the parasympathetic? Exactly. In an emergency situation, it's trying to keep you alive. Emergency situations are more complicated than rest and digest. So anatomically, that would make sense that this is more complicated because form follows function. Okay. So the preganglionic neurons for the sympathetic division are in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. This is where the cell bodies originate. This is T1 to L2. What happens at L2? Anatomically, what happens at L2? We lose that spinal cord tissue and it becomes, say it louder. I heard it. The cauda equina. The cauda equina. Okay, so we have myelinated axons that are going to come through the anterior roots, and then they're going to start branching off. So we have left and right trunks just along either side of the spinal column. On these trunks are these ganglia. They look like pearls on a string. Pearls on a string. You're welcome. I did that just for y'all. Yeah. I just wanted to show off my pearls. They're real. Somebody already bit them today. The trunk resembles a pearl necklace. So the string is the axons connecting the ganglia. The ganglia are the pearls. What is a ganglion again? Cell bodies in the periphery. Cell bodies, groups of cell bodies in the periphery is a ganglia. Thank you, Blanca. Okay, so we've got the spinal cord. Here, got the spinal cord. We're gonna do, here's a butt cheek. Sorry, I don't have really great skills. My skills are sucking here. Okay, there we go. Guy, butt cheek. It's really bad, y'all. It's really bad. I'm so sorry. Spinal cord. Here's your cauda equina. Okay, so this is essentially what we're going to look like for the sympathetic ganglia. All the way down. Beads on a string. Is that easier to conceptualize? Just like a strand of pearls. Down either side of the spinal column.
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't it? Okay, so typically you have one ganglion associated with each of the spinal nerves. In the cervical portion, it's a little bit different. So we have C1 through C1 through 7. But we only have 3 ganglia. All right, so they're going to feed into 3 separate ganglia, all associated with the cervical spinal column. Those 3 are called superior, middle, and inferior. Super creative. Which one do you think is closest to the skull? Superior, and then middle, and then inferior. You guys remember the very first lecture from 2401 where you learned superior and inferior? Yeah. Here it is. It's coming back. It's all coming back to haunt you. Okay, so these ganglia, superior, middle, and inferior, have postganglionic cells that go to specific places. So the superior cervical ganglion has postganglionic cells going strictly to the head and the neck and some into the thoracic viscera. Primarily, we're dealing with blood vessels here, sweat glands, the dilator pupillae muscle to dilate your eye, and the superior tarsal muscle of the eyelid so that you can move your eyelid up and down. The middle and inferior primarily innervate the thoracic viscera, so mostly the lower thorax, from middle and inferior postganglionic axons. Okay, so remember when we were talking about this being a 2-axon system? You have one coming from the spinal cord, synapsing into the ganglion, and then a second one going from the ganglion to the effector tissue. Which one's short here? The first one, the preganglionic, or the postganglionic? Okay, the postganglionic. Who says postganglionic is short for sympathetic? Okay, we've got 2.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, so let's go back to the drawing. Here's the spinal cord. Spinal cord is sending out projections. So here's where the cell body originates, right, in the spinal cord. And it sends out projections to the ganglion. And then so that's the primary neuron. And then the secondary neuron goes to wherever it needs to go in the thorax and innervates the tissue. So you guys are not necessarily wrong. You're just remembering what we talked about for parasympathetic. because you're right. There, the postganglionic is very short. Here, the postganglionic cell is very long. So the projection from the spinal cord to that ganglion is very, very short because the ganglia are lined right up against the spinal cord. It's very easy to get to them. But when you go from that ganglion to your effector tissue, that's when the axon gets long. Oh, no. Okay, so here are your cervical ganglia. These are your three. You guys see what I'm saying now? Maybe this is a little better to really visualize that pearls on a string. Better than my drawing. Yeah, a little bit. A lot of it. Okay, so the cervical ganglia has these three. And other than that, every spinal nerve is going to have its own, all the way from T1 all the way down to L2. And then at L2, we terminate and become the cauda equina. Oh, why did I draw a G? That's weird. So we don't need ganglia anymore necessarily to associate specifically with the spinal nerves because they're not coming out through the vertebrae anymore. They're coming out as this horse's tail shape. Okay, so here we break again into really complex physiology. So these top three ganglia, brisket tax. Oh, man. It's counting on you. Let me down. It's okay. It's fine. Just remind me and break to mark you here. Okay, so the superior cervical ganglion is going to innervate the face. So blood vessels, sweat glands, and the eye. Dilate and constrict the pupil, move the eyelid. The lower two, the middle and the inferior ganglia down here, these two, are going to innervate the heart and the lungs. So upper thoracic. So pericardial and pleural. As we go lower, we began to branch off into really complex anatomy where we start sending out primary neurons to specific ganglia. So here are your ganglia. So we have a celiac ganglion. I guess I should erase that so I can show you guys this. So celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. So this is going to innervate huge portions of your abdominal viscera. So if we look closely at the sympathetic trunk, right through here, you can see those rami structures. So here are the ganglia. I'm trying to find good ones here. They don't look like beads in this picture. Let's pretend they're beads. And off of each of those is the gray and the white ramus. Where am I at? What's happening? Sorry, y'all. I'm not loading. You think you have enough RAM. Okay, so these are the beads. Okay, these are the beads. The beads are the ganglia. And the rami are connecting in between each of the beads. Okay, so we talked about dorsal and ventral rami last time, right? They're white and gray rami. They connect all these spinal nerves to the sympathetic trunk. We're calling the sympathetic trunk those beads on a string. You have white and gray rami communicantes. The white rami are white because of a specific reason. What is typically white in the nervous system? Yeah, myelinated axons. So the white rami are myelinated preganglionic axons in the sympathetic nervous system. So myelinated preganglionic. So they take axons from the spinal cord, T1 to L2, to the trunk. That's the on-ramp. That's how we get to the rest of the body. Remember, those beads on a string are really, really close to the spinal cord. So they don't have far to go. These are myelinated preganglionic axons, and they're short. The gray rami carry unmyelinated axons from the ganglia, or specifically from the trunk to the spinal nerve. So we're going backwards. So unmyelinated means signals we're getting in to the spinal nerves are going to be faster or slower? Slower. So we're going to send out signals faster than we're going to get in signals, right? So this is our intake, our exit ramps. So we get information from the viscera to the spinal cord. Okay, we have splanchnic nerves in the sympathetic nervous system as well. The difference here is these preganglionic axons are not going to synapse in the sympathetic trunk. Instead, they're going to run anteriorly through the sympathetic trunk, and they're going to go to something called the prevertebral ganglia. So these are just anterior to the vertebral column. So if you think about where the aorta is, there is a line of ganglia just anterior to the aorta, essentially laying right on top of it. That's your prevertebral ganglia. This is that celiac, superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric ganglia that I circled on that diagram for you. So you saw how we branched out to those ganglia, those big 3 ganglia that innervated all the viscera. Those are your prevertebral ganglia, 3 big ones: celiac, superior, and inferior mesenteric. So splanchnic nerves are going to go from the sympathetic trunk all the way up to the prevertebral ganglia. So they're going to run anteriorly. Once they get to the prevertebral ganglia, then from there they'll start innervating the thoracic viscera. So breaking these down, the first is the celiac ganglion. It's attached to the celiac artery. Again, anatomists are not very creative. Celiac ganglion attached to the celiac artery running along the aorta. This is where the greater thoracic splanchnic nerves will enter. Here, the postganglionic cells are going to innervate the upper viscera, so mostly digestive. So stomach, duodenum. Do you guys know the difference between the stomach and the duodenum? The duodenum is like the tail of the stomach. That's where all the digestive enzymes are squirted into. So the stomach is mostly acid. It kills anything that's coming through. And then that bolus, we call it chyme, moves into the duodenum for real, true digestion. That's when the enzymes act on it and break it down. We'll go over all that in so much detail when we get to digestive system. But know that there's a difference. They're connected. So it's the pathway of digestion, stomach to duodenum. Also the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas, because those are where you're going to get the digestive enzymes from. Why would we want sympathetic nervous system innervating digestive organs? This is fight or flight, right? This isn't rest and digest. Digest quickly? No. That's still rest and digest, whether we're doing it quick or slow. That's still parasympathetic primarily. It shuts everything down. If sympathetic is activated heavily enough, it shuts down what's going on here. Shuts down these digestive organs so that you can move blood flow elsewhere, so that you can address whatever other more pressing matter is in front of you. So that's celiac ganglion, that's the one that's upper. Next to the celiac artery, along the aorta. And the spleen as well, but who cares about the spleen? The superior mesenteric ganglia is adjacent to the superior mesenteric artery. So the lower thoracic splanchnic nerves are going to come through this area. And it's going to send out postganglionic cells to the lower digestive system. No worries. The intestines, the kidneys, the ureters, pancreas. So moving down the line, down that aorta. Celiac is up top by the celiac artery, superior mesenteric near the superior mesenteric artery, and then comes the inferior mesenteric of the prevertebral ganglia. So this is next to the, inferior mesenteric artery. So splanchnic nerves from the lumbar region. So remember, we're thoracolumbar right now, all the way down to L2. So the splanchnic nerves coming off of the lumbar region are going to innervate this inferior mesenteric ganglia next to the inferior mesenteric artery. So those postganglionic axons from the inferior mesenteric ganglia are going to go down to the large intestine and the rectum, the reproductive organs, and the bladder and ureters for excretion. Do you see how anatomically we're going down the line? Starting at the top with the celiac, we're doing the upper digestive, and then the superior mesenteric is kind of the middle, and then the inferior mesenteric is lower abdominopelvic region. So it all kind of flows. There is some organization here, more out of necessity than anything else. Meiosis.
Yeah.
Wrong meiosis. This is meiosis. Okay. So Horner syndrome is a Horner syndrome is a condition caused by injury to the cervical sympathetic trunk. It can cause a couple of different distinct symptoms. So eyelids drooping, ptosis. This is because the superior tarsal muscles, the one that moves your eyelid, allows you to open your eyes, is damaged. Meiosis, inability to dilate the pupil, so the pupil stays permanently constricted. It's because damage to that postganglionic cell has prevented innervation of that tissue. Anhidrosis, lack of sweating, which would be kind of nice right now in here, because the sweat glands are not getting that signal from the sympathetic nervous system because they're damaged. And facial flushing. Remember, a lot of these signals deal with smooth muscle contraction. So if your blood vessels are continually dilated, then your face will flush. Okay, so that was the out pathway. Let's look at the in pathway. So there are 4 different ways that axons, I guess these are still the exiting the trunk. Okay, exiting the trunk, 4 different ways. So the spinal nerve pathway allows us to exit for the upper body, the neck, torso, and limbs. So specifically glands in the skin of the neck, torso, and limbs. So the preganglionic cell is going to go into the sympathetic ganglion it's associated with, and it's going to synapse onto that secondary neuron. That postganglionic cell is going to travel to the gray ramus. Gray ramus is myelinated or not? Not, because it's gray. Gray matter, gray ramus, non-myelinated. It's going to go through the gray ramus. It's at the same level as the ganglion. And go into that spinal nerve, pair with it, and follow it to the effector cell. It's a spinal nerve pathway because we're following the spinal nerves. The sympathetic cells in the spinal nerve pathway follow the spinal nerves. It's like your little brother or sister following you around the neighborhood when you're a kid. It stays right next to you, all the way to the effector tissue, all the way to your best friend's house. And you're like, come on. I don't want to hang out with you. Is it just me? 3 younger sisters. That happened every day of my life. Okay. Okay, so let's look at these. So here's our sympathetic trunk. It's our string of pearls. So pearl, pearl, pearl. Here's our spinal nerve coming out, synapsing onto a postganglionic cell. Here we can have preganglionic cells come out into the ganglion, and then postganglionic cells being synapsed onto by multiple ganglia, or by cells from multiple ganglia, sending out signals to the effector tissues through those postganglionic projections that can pair with the spinal nerves. So the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway is primarily associated with the organs in the neck and the thorax, so upper chest, so the heart, the esophagus, the skin effectors, so the sweat glands and the blood vessels, in the head and neck, and the eyelid and dilator pupillae muscles. The preganglionic cells are going to come in and synapse into the sympathetic trunk just like we would expect them to. The postganglionic cell is going to go straight from the trunk to the effector. It doesn't have to go through the gray ramus. It just goes straight to the effector. Okay, do you see the difference here? So we did have these cells that were coming in, they were synapsing here, and then they followed out the spinal nerves. Here we can go straight to the effector tissue from the ganglion. So here's one ganglion, here's another. We can go straight to the effector tissue. And this is upper body, so thorax, neck, thoracic viscera, so heart and lungs, blood vessels, and sweat glands in the skin. Okay. So the splanchnic nerve pathway, this is pathway number 3. This is involved in innervating the abdominal and pelvic viscera, so everything basically below the diaphragm. So you guys remember the thorax was separated from the abdominopelvic region via the diaphragm. This is the only thing separating them. Nothing separating the abdominal and pelvic regions. Everything's just kind of shoved in there together. All right, so the splanchnic nerve pathway is going to innervate everything below the diaphragm. So the preganglionic cells bypass the sympathetic trunk. They just shoot right past it. They don't synapse in there. The axons that are going to these prevertebral ganglia from the splanchnic nerves will synapse there in the prevertebral ganglia. The postganglionic axons will then travel from those ganglia and innervate the effectors. So here's the difference. We're just swinging straight out through. We don't synapse here in the ganglia at all, like we did in the last 2 pathways. We synapse in this prevertebral ganglion. Then we send that postganglionic cell out to the effector tissue. You guys see the distinction? Where before we had to synapse in the trunk, the previous 2 pathways were synapsing in the trunk. This one we do not. Splanchnic nerves, they bypass those ganglia in the trunk, they go straight to the peripheral ganglia. Okay. And the fourth is the adrenal medulla. So this innervates the adrenal gland, specifically the medulla of the adrenal gland, which is to say the middle of the adrenal gland. Here, the axons will extend through the sympathetic trunk, they'll extend through the prevertebral ganglia, and they will not synapse anywhere that they pass. The preganglionic cell will stimulate directly at the adrenal medulla, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, for those of you who had me in 2401, were what? Norepinephrine's your ready for action hormone. Yeah, it's my favorite hormone. Or, well, it's not a hormone, it's a neurotransmitter, specifically, can act as a hormone. It's your ready for action molecule. It's your ready for action neurotransmitter. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. The adrenal medulla pathway is part of the sympathetic response, the fight or flight response, because it releases the two chemicals that you absolutely need for fight and flight. You need adrenaline, you need epinephrine, and you need norepinephrine in order to mobilize blood supply to get to skeletal muscle so that you can be physically ready to do whatever it is you need to do in response to that threat.
When you're anaphylactic, you do too much norepinephrine?
I don't know. You would have an activation of it, yeah. I don't know what you would define as too much under anaphylaxis, though. But the idea is that, yeah, you would definitely need.
Because they give you the epinephrine to slow it down.
They do.
So it's just
You need it because it's a stressor. So anaphylaxis is a stressor. It's a severe stressor. It's going to take you out of any sort of parasympathetic response. It's going to move you to a sympathetic response. Whether or not your body can mount an appropriate sympathetic response, I think, depends on the degree to which you're exposed to something that causes anaphylaxis, and also any underlying physiology. So like for a kid, it's going to be a lot harder. So boosting with norepinephrine will help that sympathetic response. Also probably release a lot more histamine. Okay. All right, so adrenal medulla. Again, we're coming out of the spinal cord. We're going through our ganglia. We're not synapsing in the prevertebral ganglion. We're not synapsing in our trunk, our sympathetic trunk at all. We just go straight to the effector tissue, specifically the adrenal medulla, which is the middle of the adrenal gland. And we're synapsing in there, and we're releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to whatever is attacking us or whatever we're trying to run away from. More adrenaline, always a good thing during serious fight or flight responses. So that's pathway number 4. Okay, so for these pathways, I want you to know where the first cell synapses, where does the preganglionic cell synapse, and where does the postganglionic cell synapse. I think this one's going to be the easiest. So know that for all 4 of these sympathetic pathways. Okay. Actually, let's take a break into, let's see, where are we at? Nope, let's keep going. All right, let's look at autonomic plexuses. So that first image I showed you guys of all those ganglia and all of those projections to all those other ganglia with all those other projections to the visceral organs, those are the plexuses of the autonomic nervous system. These are networks of nerves in your chest and in your abdomen that innervate all of those thoracocolumnar viscera. They contain sympathetic postganglionic axons, because remember in the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic is the long cell. Parasympathetic preganglionic axons, because it's the preganglionic cell that's long. and visceral sensory axons. The cardiac plexus gives us innervation from the sympathetic nervous system that starts in the cervical and the thoracic trunk. So this is going to increase your heart rate. To oppose that, we would get innervation from the parasympathetic axons via the vagus nerve to slow the heart rate. So these are going to act in balance with each other to control your heart. The pulmonary plexus is going to give us bronchodilation via the cervical and thoracic trunk axons. Bronchodilation is associated with sympathetic response. We want our bronchi dilated when we need to get oxygen to our tissues quickly. Again, vagus, because it innervates everything down here, is going to cause bronchoconstriction under parasympathetic control, so rest and digest. You don't need to be breathing as deeply. You don't need to be oxygenating as efficiently. Vagus nerve is going to initiate that parasympathetic response in the pulmonary plexus. The esophageal plexus, remember we were talking about those upper, middle, and lower digestive organs in the sympathetic and how we would need to shut all that down? Sympathetic also shuts down the esophagus. So cervical and thoracic innervation to the esophagus decreases motility. Parasympathetic opens up the cardiac sphincter with swallowing. And again, that's vagus nerve. When in doubt, and I'm talking about parasympathetic, just say vagus nerve. You have like a 60% chance of getting it right. The abdominal aortic plexus. These are the three that we talked about, the celiac, the superior and inferior mesenteric plexuses. So these are where those sympathetic postganglionic cells are coming through the prevertebral ganglia. The parasympathetic preganglionic cells are from either the pelvic splanchnic or the vagus nerves. They go all through the abdomen, all of your abdominal viscera, some pelvic organs as well. And it covers all pelvic organs. Okay. The hypogastric plexus gives you sympathetic projections from the aortic plexus and directly from the sympathetic trunk. The pelvic splanchnic nerves are your source for parasympathetic. This also innervates the pelvic region. So hypogastric. Hypogastric, do you guys remember that very first lab from 2401 where you broke up the abdomen into the 4 quadrants and then the 9 coordinates? So you had the hypogastric region below the belly button, hypogastric plexus. Everything in that region is innervated by these autonomic nerves. Innervates all of those pelvic viscera. And you've got both sympathetic and parasympathetic here. Because again, everything is in balance. So here are your plexuses. So this is actually kind of cool. Here's your cardiac plexus, pulmonary in this nice, pretty net here, and esophageal to the side. Celiac plexus, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, and hypogastric. So these are nets. They're networks of nerves coming together to innervate specific areas of tissue, either sympathetic or parasympathetic, in balance so that your body maintains homeostasis. Thank you. You know, if I gestured enough, I get it. But also allowing you to exit homeostasis when you need to. That's the whole purpose of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, is that if we need to exit homeostasis transiently, we can, and we have an opposing force to bring us back once the threat is over. Okay, so let's see. Enteric nervous system. Okay, so we have autonomic motor and visceral sensory coming through the GI tract, giving us innervation to the smooth muscle and the glands so that we can have enough secretion of mucus and other fluids for digestion, and to contract the smooth muscle so that we can undergo peristalsis. Peristalsis is the process of moving food through the intestines. So muscles have to coordinate contraction in order for peristalsis to take place. That's what we do with the autonomic motor function, primarily through the, which nerve? The vagus. Yeah, okay. So there are two plexuses associated with this. So the submucosal and the myenteric plexus. Okay, so answer those questions. What did you learn as you're reading? The autonomic nervous system primarily uses norepinephrine/epinephrine and acetylcholine as its neurotransmitters. So either one can cause stimulation or inhibition. It depends on the receptor type and density in the effector tissue. So wherever that nerve is synapsing onto, the receptors in that tissue are going to designate the response, not the nerve. The nerve can stimulate, but if the right receptors aren't there, then you're not going to get the right response. Each tissue has a specific profile of either acetylcholine or norepinephrine receptors that allow for specific or wide activation, slow or fast activation of that tissue. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so if a cell releases acetylcholine, we call that a cholinergic cell, or cholinergic neuron. All of the preganglionic autonomic neurons are cholinergic. Neurons that innervate muscles at the neuromuscular junction are cholinergic. All parasympathetic ganglionic neurons are cholinergic. And any sympathetic ganglionic cell going to sweat glands or blood vessels, involuntary muscle is going to be cholinergic. The target cell has to have cholinergic receptors. There are two types. We talked about one type last semester when we were talking about neuromuscular junction. That was the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. There's also a muscarinic acetylcholine receptor, and the density of these two will determine the response. If a cell is releasing norepinephrine, we call that an adrenergic cell. Sympathetic ganglion neurons are primarily adrenergic, and their target cells have adrenergic receptors. So this is a good summary of the sympathetic and parasympathetic cells that are involved in cholinergic versus adrenergic signaling. So those nicotinic and muscarinic receptors, they're going to have different anatomical distributions and different actions. So the nicotinic receptor is on all the ganglionic neurons. It's on the adrenal medulla cells, and it is the receptor we find at the neuromuscular junction. When acetylcholine binds that receptor, what happens? Sodium moves into the cell because that receptor can be called a ligand-gated ion channel. It's a ligand-gated ion channel, specifically a cation channel. So sodium's going to move into the cell as soon as acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. We abbreviate this NACHR. So when sodium moves into a cell, what happens to that membrane potential? It depolarizes. What direction is that? Up. Up. So a cell is normally polarized, sitting somewhere around minus 60, minus 70 millivolts. We hang there. Our baseline is negative. So when we depolarize, we move away from that negative value. That means our value is actually becoming more positive, closer to zero. So every time that cell polarizes, we have an excitatory postsynaptic potential produced. And if we get enough of those together, summation, either temporal or spatial summation, then we can fire an action potential. Okay, so there are a couple of subtypes of nicotinic receptors that are specifically targeted by pharmaceutical agents. So like the subtype of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that we find at the neuromuscular junction are blocked by a poison, plant-derived poison called curare. So this will paralyze you if you're exposed to it. But it won't affect your autonomic cells, even though they are also expressing nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, because the subtypes, the subunits within those ligand-gated channels are different. Okay, muscarinic receptors. These are in all of the parasympathetic target organs. So all of your effector tissues have muscarinic receptors. Some of your sympathetic tissues have muscarinic receptors. So sweat glands and blood vessels in skeletal muscle have muscarinic receptors as well. Remember, they also had nicotinic receptors. So they're going to be in balance, so whether or not you're going to be really sweating or not. All of the muscarinic receptors use second messengers. So they're going to be slower than opening an ion channel, right? Because we've got to activate a second messenger system. Not by a whole lot, but still a little bit slower. We've got a few more steps if we want to activate a muscarinic receptor and then have some effect happen. If it's a nicotinic receptor and we just open that channel, sodium flows in and we either get a response or we don't. Muscarinic, we've got to activate a G protein, we've got to activate a second messenger. So in the smooth muscle, in the GI tract, muscarinic receptors will cause more contraction of the smooth muscle. But in the heart, acetylcholine can bind to a muscarinic receptor and it can slow contraction of the cardiac muscle, slow the heart rate. This again is due to different subunits in the muscarinic receptors. So just because it's a muscarinic receptor doesn't mean it's the same as all other muscarinic receptors. It depends on which specific subunits have been inserted for that specific receptor. Okay, so my favorite, norepinephrine. We call this a catecholamine. It's a biogenic amine. It's very similar to serotonin, dopamine, histamine. Catecholamines are ligands that are going to bind to membrane receptors. So the receptors are expressed in the membrane of the postsynaptic cell. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are catecholamines that bind to adrenergic receptors. The primary types of adrenergic receptors you're going to see are called alpha receptors and beta receptors. Alpha receptors are just about without exception stimulated by norepinephrine, activated by norepinephrine. Beta can go either way. They can be stimulated or inhibited. So alpha can be broken down even further into alpha 1 versus alpha 2. Alpha 1 is on smooth muscle cells. So if you activate an alpha 1 receptor, then you can cause vasoconstriction. You can cause your erector pili muscles to activate, which gives you goosebumps or goose pimples. This causes uterine contractions. This can dilate your pupil and urethral sphincter closing. So again, alpha receptors just about always activating, and they tend to cause things to contract if they're alpha 1 subtype receptors. Alpha 2 is primarily in your central nervous system. It's in your GI tract and in your pancreas. So in your GI tract, alpha 2 will cause constriction. In the CNS, it can cause release of it can cause initiation of another action potential. And in the pancreas, it will inhibit insulin secretion. Okay, so that was alpha. So alpha 1, alpha 2. So we have beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. So beta 1 are just like alpha 1. They're primarily stimulatory. In the heart, they increase the force of contraction and the rate of contraction. And in the kidney, they stimulate renin secretion. In beta 2 receptors, you're going to balance out anything you've done with beta 1 receptor activation. So a lot of times they're expressed in certain ratios in tissues that need to be modulated. So some tissues we want to activate or we don't, right? And some tissues we want to modulate, we want to maintain a balance. So that's why catecholamines, biogenic amines, are so good to use for this, is because we can balance with them. These are the modulatory neurotransmitters. And we can do that because we have this wide array of receptors. So our beta 2 receptor is going to inhibit to balance out beta 1s. This is in the smooth muscles that line the arteries going to your heart. Liver and skeletal muscle, this can dilate those blood vessels. They also cause bronchodilation when stimulated. they can relax the muscles of the uterine and GI tract, and they can relax the detrusor muscle of the bladder. Beta 3 is our mixed bag, kind of like alpha 2, where it could be stimulatory or inhibitory. In adipose tissue, beta 3 is what you want to stimulate if you want to access those triglycerides, triglyceride, glycerol, and 3 fatty acids, so that you can use them in beta oxidation so that you can access fat as fuel. It also relaxes the smooth muscle in your bladder. What type of tissue is your bladder made of? Transitional, yeah, transitional tissue. So we can relax the smooth muscle around that transitional tissue, allowing those cells to change shape, relax the bladder, allow it to expand. I have you guys for 15 more minutes, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so asthma is a condition where the bronchioles are not dilating properly, so you can't get enough oxygen in. The bronchioles express beta 2 receptors. What were those? Excitatory or inhibitory? Inhibitory. Epinephrine can bind beta 2 better than norepinephrine can. So we use epinephrine to treat asthma because it relaxes the smooth muscles in the bronchioles, allowing them to dilate so that you can get more air in. Okay, some more review questions for y'all. I'm serious, y'all need to be getting together. Who's made friends in this class? Who has friends? I know you have friends. All right, so Kia has friends. Nobody else has friends? Make friends. I'm gonna give y'all an assignment this week, and I want the answer before Friday. I'm gonna give you, okay. It's going to require you to make friends. Yeah. I'm forcing you to be social. I don't know, however many friends it takes. We'll see. It's gonna be like an epic game of telephone. Okay. Autonomic tone. Okay, so we've been talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic, right, and how they're in balance. This is autonomic tone. We keep our body in or near homeostasis by activating both divisions of the autonomic nervous system at the same time, but not to the same degree. We continuously release neurotransmitters to generate autonomic tone. In some cases, one division is active. If you're in a life-threatening situation or you're trying to have a baby, primarily one system is active. But there are, in general, always sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs going on at the same time in every system in your body to make sure that you're maintaining exactly the right amount of activation you need in order to function as a human. So, in the case of one division controlling what's happening, so if sympathetic innervation of your blood vessels, keeping them, so there's sympathetic innervation of your blood vessels is generally keeping them kind of constricted. You don't want your blood vessels fully relaxed all the time or for any real significant period of time, right? What would happen if all of your blood vessels relaxed all at once? Your blood pressure would plummet. I have you guys for 10. Okay, yeah, they're just being loud. Okay, this is called vasomotor tone. We try to keep that slight level of constriction all the time because if we don't, our blood pressure drops really fast, right? And our heart can't pump enough blood to move enough oxygen to keep us alive. If you need to get more blood moving, sympathetic tone increases, constricting those blood vessels a little further. If you're relaxing, sympathetic activity will decrease a little bit, the vessels will dilate a little bit more, your body won't have to focus so much on moving blood as fast. An example of this is vagal tone, continually keeping your heart rate in a lower range. Okay, dual innervation. This is when an organ is receiving input from both sympathetic and parasympathetic. As we were looking through sympathetic and parasympathetic, most organs get this, right? Most organs have dual innervation. You have two divisions, and they act in an antagonistic way to balance each other out. Sometimes they can act in a cooperative way. If you have... Sorry, ma'am. If you have parasympathetic activity in your cardiac tissue, it's going to slow your heart rate down. Sympathetic activity would speed it up. You don't want one or the other taking over. So you have both cholinergic and adrenergic receptors in your cardiac tissue. You have both cholinergic and adrenergic stimulation to your cardiac tissue to maintain a range of activation. Same in the GI tract, where you don't want too much motility in your gut. That's explosive diarrhea. Yeah, we don't want that, right? So we got to limit what the parasympathetic system is doing. Sympathetic will decrease motility a little bit so that you guys can hold your bowels long enough to get through class. And the control of the pupil dilator muscle in the eye. Parasympathetic will decrease pupil dilation. Sympathetic activity in cocaine will increase pupil dilation. These systems then cooperate, like in sex. Did we do sex as an example in lab last time? Was one of the groups? No? So my second class, every group did sex. Every one of them. They did the sex. Yeah. So sex is sympathetic and parasympathetic. Arousal is sympathetic. Orgasm is parasympathetic. And you have to have a balance between the two. You have to be relaxed. The actual act of ejaculation is sympathetic. There's a balance between the two. And also, there's somatic innervation. So you have three branches feeding into this. Your body systems tend to work together. Sometimes it's an antagonistic thing, sometimes it's cooperative, like in sex. This must be my highfalutin class. Your minds are not yet in the gutter. My highfalutin class. Highfalutin. High class. High class class. Well, because none of you, never mind. Okay, all right. No, I don't. It's fine. I want you to just go where you want to go with anything you want to go with. I just, like, over and over again, last week was sex. Okay. Can we do, like, heart attack or something? Anything like that? No, we can't. Anyway. Sometimes we have systems that are controlled by only one division. That is primarily going to be the sympathetic division. Sympathetic is going to focus on making sure you are staying alive. Blood vessels, primarily sympathetic. They don't really have any innervation from the parasympathetic system. You just change the tone of the sympathetic nervous system. More sympathetic innervation or less, depending on whether or not you want to constrict or dilate the blood vessels. Sweat glands and erector pili muscles are also sympathetic only. And the adrenal medulla, sympathetic only. Remember, that's releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, the two neurotransmitters that are important for sympathetic response. So it wouldn't make sense for the parasympathetic nervous system to be innervating the adrenal medulla because those neurotransmitters don't really help us in parasympathetic response. Okay, briefly, Raynaud syndrome. This is when you have the microvessels in your digits, so your fingers and toes, will just constrict for no reason. And they kind of go numb, and they turn blue, and it hurts a lot. It can be triggered by cold that would normally not bother a human, or emotional distress. And it is due to a dysregulated or exaggerated response in the sympathetic nervous system. Because remember, the blood vessels are strictly sympathetic. It's just more or less sympathetic to constrict or dilate. This happens a lot in women. You grab a girl's hand and it's really cold and it's blue and she says, ouch. Tell her to go to the doctor. Okay, questions? All right, let's fly through autonomic reflexes. I think we can do this, yeah. Okay, so autonomic reflexes are visceral reflexes. These are responses that we do automatically to a stimulus that's generated by a reflex arc. I think we talked about reflex arcs last time, right? We reviewed that briefly. Okay, so the arc includes the receptor detecting the stimulus, sensory relay to the central nervous system, which is spinal cord at least, maybe brain, but probably just spinal cord, integrating that information, sending the information to a motor neuron, and then sending that signal to respond to the effector tissue. The autonomic nervous system effector tissues are going to be smooth muscles, glands, and the heart. The cardiovascular reflex is triggered by baroreceptors, so stretch receptors. They detect pressure changes in the blood vessel walls. So these baroreceptors detect changes in the pressure in the wall, sends a signal about that pressure to your medulla, to the cardiac centers, the BNST, in the medulla, that then either stops sympathetic response or activates parasympathetic response to either speed up or slow down the heart rate. In general, the reflex is going to try to decrease the amount of blood that's being pumped through the heart so that you can decrease the blood pressure. The gastrointestinal reflex for defecation is something that's generally pretty natural. It is another baroreceptor. So as long as your baroreceptors are detecting the presence of fecal matter, they can detect the stretch in your rectum, send that signal to your spinal cord. Your spinal cord then says, yep, there's poop, let's get rid of it. Then the spinal cord will send out a motor command through the motor neurons to make the anal sphincter relax and the colon and rectum contract. Hopefully in an appropriate place. Urination or micturition reflex, you laugh, but sometimes. This is another stretch receptor or baroreceptor mediated reflex. So remember, we're looking at changes to tissue in every single one of these cases. The stretch receptors will signal when the bladder is full. When that transitional tissue has stretched so far that it really shouldn't stretch anymore, that's when the baroreceptors are activated. The signal is sent to the spinal cord integrates that information, and the motor command to empty the bladder is sent out. We have some control over this. We have lots of control over this. It takes some time to get control over this. It takes time. I'm potty training my toddler right now. Oh my God, it takes time. But once we have the mental capacity to control this reflex, then we can signal through the pons to voluntarily empty our bladder as soon as we feel that stretch receptor stimulus. Until then, it's a reflexive action. He's getting better. All right, here are your summary slides of that. Okay, let's see. Autonomic dysreflexia. This is where blood pressure spikes because of a stimulated sympathetic reflex. So it causes vasoconstriction, which increases your blood pressure really fast. This is commonly found when your spinal cord is injured and you have an autonomic system disbalance, causing overstimulation through the autonomic nervous system of the cardiac muscle or of the smooth muscles surrounding the blood vessels. The injury is typically a spinal cord injury, so you have spinal shock and then you lose those autonomic reflexes. So if you have somebody with a spinal cord injury come in, be on the lookout for this, those of you who are going into the medical field. You'll see other areas of involuntary relaxation as well. So other reflexes can also fail in response to this. Okay, I think that's it for autonomic, y'all. Good job.